My name is Vivienne Ashby. I'm 31 years old and I've been working at my husband's family landscaping company for the past 4 years, ever since I married into the Ashby family, and my father-in-law asked if I'd help manage the books while he recovered from a knee surgery. That was supposed to be temporary. It never really ended. And honestly, I didn't mind. I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me in a way that people sometimes didn't. But this story isn't about numbers. It's about the night my husband's older brother stood up at our Thanksgiving dinner and told 60 people that I had been skimming money from the company for 2 years. And it's about why I was the only one in that dining room who wasn't surprised. I need to back up a little. My husband's name is Fletcher. We met in our late 20s, got married quickly by most people's standards, 14 months from first date to wedding, and I had no idea what I was walking into with his family. Fletcher is warm and patient and genuinely one of the kindest people I've ever known. His older brother, though? His older brother is something else entirely. Donovan is 41. He's the eldest Ashby child, and he has never once let anyone forget it. From the very first dinner I attended at the family home, he had a way of speaking to me that felt like he was doing me a favor just by acknowledging I existed. When I joined the company, it got worse. He would make small corrections during staff meetings, not because I was wrong, but because he wanted the room to know he could correct me. He would forward emails I'd already answered, with a note to the team saying he wanted to loop everyone in. When I reorganized the invoicing system and cut processing time by nearly a third, he announced it at the quarterly meeting as a team improvement, not mine specifically. Fletcher noticed. He said something to Donovan once. Donovan laughed and said I was oversensitive and that maybe I wasn't cut out for a family business environment. I kept working. I kept doing my job. I also, quietly, started keeping very careful records, not because I suspected anything at first, just because I'm the kind of person who documents things. Call it a habit, or call it the way my brain works. Every transfer, every invoice approval, every vendor payment, I kept a second set of notes at home. My own little backup system, mostly for peace of mind. That habit is the only reason the Thanksgiving dinner ended the way it did. Let me tell you about that night. The house smelled like rosemary and butter when we arrived, and Fletcher's mother had outdone herself with the table. She always does. Linen napkins, the good china, small gourds arranged down the center with candles in between. She's the kind of woman who treats a holiday meal like an act of love, and it shows in every detail. There were maybe 16 people seated at the long dining table and another 10 or so scattered around the connected sitting room with plates on their laps. Extended family, a few family friends, a couple of cousins I recognized, and some I didn't. I had dressed carefully that morning, not formally. It was family Thanksgiving, but thoughtfully. I wanted to feel like myself. Fletcher squeezed my hand when we walked in and whispered that I looked beautiful, and I felt settled. Good. Ready for a normal holiday. Donovan was already there when we arrived, standing near the fireplace with a glass of something amber, talking to one of Fletcher's uncles. He glanced over when we walked in. I smiled in his direction. He didn't smile back. He just turned back to his conversation, and something in my stomach shifted the way it always did around him, a low, quiet alarm I'd learned not to ignore. Dinner itself was lovely. For about an hour, everything was warm plates and easy conversation and someone's toddler cousin making everyone laugh by methodically dismantling a dinner roll. Fletcher was telling a story about a job site that had gone sideways in the funniest way possible, and I was watching him and feeling grateful and full and ordinary. Normal. Happy. Then Donovan stood up. He didn't clink a glass or clear his throat the way people do when they're making a toast. He just stood, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone with a certain kind of authority takes up space. He waited until he had everyone's attention. Then he said he had something he needed to address before the evening went any further. That he was sorry to bring it up at a family gathering, but that some things couldn't wait. Fletcher looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us knew what was coming. Donovan set his glass down on the mantel and said that the company had recently completed an internal review of its accounts. He said the review had flagged a pattern of irregularities, and then he turned and looked directly at me across the table and said that the irregularities traced back to my access credentials. For a moment, the room didn't react. I think people weren't sure they'd heard correctly. Then they were sure, and the whispers started. I felt every single one of them like a cold draft through a window you didn't know was open. Fletcher's mother's face went slack. An aunt I'd always liked dropped her fork. Someone on the other side of the room asked what Donovan had said, and someone closer repeated it, and suddenly the word irregularities was traveling around the room in a dozen different mouths. Fletcher pushed his chair back immediately and said, "What are you talking about?" Not a question, more like a warning. Donovan held up one hand, patient, calm, entirely in control of the room the way he always wanted to be. He said he had documentation. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He had worn a jacket to Thanksgiving, which in retrospect should have told me something, and pulled out a folded set of papers. He unfolded them slowly and set them on the table in front of Fletcher. 3 pages, printed, columns of numbers with dates and reference codes down the left side. He said 8 transfers over 11 months, just under $5,000 each, structured to stay below reporting thresholds, all originating from vendor payment accounts that I had sole approval authority over. I watched Fletcher's face as he looked at the papers. I watched him absorb the numbers, the dates, the way it was all laid out cleanly and convincingly. I watched him look up at Donovan and then slowly turn toward me. "Vivienne," he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry yet. It was something worse than angry. It was uncertain. And here is the thing I need to tell you about that moment. I was not scared. I was not panicking. My heart was beating fast, but not from fear, from something closer to recognition. Because standing there in that dining room with 60 people staring at me, I was looking at Donovan's folded papers and thinking, I knew something like this was coming. I just didn't know when. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been running our standard end-of-month reconciliation when I noticed something I couldn't account for. A vendor payment from one of our smaller landscape supply accounts, routine on its face. The kind of line item that could pass a casual review without anyone blinking, but the invoice number didn't match anything in my system. I pulled the associated files. The vendor contact email was 1 character different from our actual vendor's address. I sat very still at my desk for a long time. I didn't say anything to Fletcher. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said a word to anyone. So I called a friend from my accounting program, someone who now works in corporate forensic finance, and I asked for help tracing it. Quietly, privately, carefully. What she found made my hands go cold. The transfers had been initiated under my credentials, yes, but the login timestamps didn't match my working hours. They came in on weekday evenings, 2 of them on days I could document being physically elsewhere. And the device ID attached to 3 of the logins was not any device I owned or had ever registered to my name. Someone had used my login to move money. My friend helped me pull a full report. We documented everything: timestamps, device IDs, IP addresses, the slight discrepancies in how the fake invoice amounts had been formatted compared to my usual practice. She compiled it into a clean summary and sent it to me encrypted. I saved 3 copies in 3 different places. I had been carrying that report around in my own jacket pocket for 9 days, waiting to understand who had done this and why, before I decided what to do next. And now Donovan was standing at the Thanksgiving table explaining his documentation to my husband's entire extended family, and I understood exactly what I was looking at. I let him finish. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He laid out every transfer amount, every date, explained the structure of the vendor account, described the approval process with just enough technical detail to sound credible to people who didn't work in finance. He never raised his voice. He expressed regret about the timing. He said this wasn't something he wanted to do, but that he had a responsibility to the family. When he finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the candles. Fletcher said my name again, this time differently. I set my napkin on the table. I reached down and picked up the small bag I'd brought with me, the one I'd carried every day for the past week, and I unzipped it slowly. I took out my phone. And then I took out a folded envelope. I looked at Donovan, and I said, "I'd like to respond to that." He blinked. He hadn't expected me to be this calm, I think. He had expected tears or denial, or some version of a scene that would have confirmed for everyone watching that I was guilty and panicking. I said, "But before I do, I'd like to know if those transfers were made from my devices." Donovan frowned slightly. He said the transfers were made using my login credentials. Yes, I nodded, and I asked if anyone at the table would like to know which device actually initiated them. The room was still. I opened the envelope and removed 4 printed pages. I walked them over to Fletcher and set them in front of him. Then I set my phone beside the papers, already open to the secure email my friend had sent me. Fletcher looked down at the pages. He looked at the phone, and then he looked up at me, and something in his face shifted. The uncertainty replaced by something slower and heavier as he started reading. I waited. I had become very good at waiting. Fletcher read for about 2 minutes without speaking. Then he set the papers down on the table and looked at his brother. He asked, "Is this your laptop's device ID?" Donovan's expression didn't change right away. He was good at that, holding a face in place when it wanted to move. He said he didn't know what that meant. Fletcher slid the papers toward him across the table. He said, "The login timestamps. Look at the second column." Donovan looked down at the pages. I watched him read. I watched the moment he got to the part that mattered. I watched his jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly. Fletcher's mother said quietly, "What is happening?" Fletcher said, "Mom, give me a minute." He looked back at Donovan and said, "The transfers were initiated from a laptop registered to the business. I know that laptop. That's the one that sits in your office because you refuse to use the cloud system. You told me 3 times this year it was too slow." Donovan said, slowly, that he didn't know how his device could have been used, that anyone could have accessed his office. And then something happened that I hadn't entirely planned for but that I'd hoped might. Fletcher's uncle, a quiet man named Bertram who had worked in logistics for 30 years, leaned forward and said, "Hang on." He said he had been at the office on one of the dates on that sheet. He said he remembered because it was the same afternoon the loading dock delivery came in late, and he'd stayed to supervise it. And he said the only person he had seen in the building past 5 o'clock was Donovan. He said he remembered because Donovan had waved at him from the hallway and told him not to work too hard. The room had gone very, very still. Donovan looked at Bertram. He looked at Fletcher. He looked, finally, at me. I said gently that I had also asked my friend to check whether the transfers were structured to benefit anyone connected to the company. I said the receiving account wasn't empty. I said the name on that account was not one I recognized. But I said I had given all of this to my accountant, and I had also made an appointment with an attorney, and if anyone wanted to pursue the full picture, I wasn't going to stand in the way of that. One of the cousins whispered something to her husband. Someone across the room set their plate down on the floor. Fletcher stood up. He didn't raise his voice. Fletcher almost never raises his voice, but there's a tone he has, very quiet, very controlled, that I've heard maybe twice in our marriage, and it is far more serious than shouting. He looked at his brother and used that tone. He said, "You put this together to get rid of her." Donovan started to speak, and Fletcher said, "Don't." He said, "You spent 4 years trying to push her out, and instead of just saying you didn't want her here, you built a case. You moved money out of our company, you moved it under her name, and you stood up at Mom's Thanksgiving table to do it in front of everyone." Donovan's composure finally cracked. He said Fletcher didn't understand. He said I was an outsider who had come into their company and their family and changed things, and that the family didn't need someone like me making decisions. Fletcher said, "Vivienne has saved this company more money in 4 years than you generated in 10. I've seen the numbers. I looked the other way with you for a long time because you're my brother. I'm not looking the other way anymore." The room had stopped pretending not to listen. Fletcher's mother stood up from her chair. She was shaking a little. She looked at Donovan for a long moment, and then she said, "You will leave this house. Tonight." I had not expected her. I hadn't known which way she would go. She had always been gentle with Donovan in the way that mothers sometimes are, with the child who seems to need them most. Watching her make that choice, in that room, in front of everyone, I had to look down at my plate for a moment. Donovan left. He didn't say anything else. He took his papers and his jacket, and he walked out the front door, and the sound of it closing behind him was somehow very quiet for how much weight it carried. For a while, Nobody moved. The toddler cousin, who had no idea what had just happened, attempted to steal a dinner roll from someone's plate, and a few people laughed. A little too loud, a little too quickly, but it broke something in the air that needed breaking. Fletcher came and sat back down beside me. He didn't say anything right away. He took my hand under the table and held it, and that was enough. Bertram cleared his throat across the table and asked if we should see about the pie. Someone said that was the best idea they'd heard all evening. I have to be honest with you about what happened after. The weeks that followed were not easy. Donovan's absence from the company created its own kind of disruption. Accounts that needed untangling, vendor relationships that had to be rebuilt, a staff that had questions we didn't always have clean answers to. Fletcher and I had long conversations in the evenings, sitting at our kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold, working through what we knew and what we still didn't and what we were going to do about it. We did speak with an attorney. The attorney was straightforward about the situation. There was documentation, there was a forensic trail, there was a potential case. She said the decision was ours to make. We talked about it for 2 weeks. In the end, we required Donovan to repay every dollar of what had been moved. Full repayment documented before the end of the fiscal year. He agreed in writing through his own attorney. In exchange, we didn't pursue criminal charges. That was a choice Fletcher made, mostly. He said he needed to be able to look at himself in a few years and know he had handled it in a way he could live with. I respected that. I didn't entirely share it, but I respected it. Donovan has not been back to the company. He has not been to a family dinner since Thanksgiving. I don't know if that will ever change. What I do know is this. Fletcher's mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon about a month after that night. I was at my desk going over Q4 projections. She asked if I had a few minutes. I said of course. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wanted to apologize. Not on behalf of Donovan. She was clear that wasn't hers to give. But for the times over the years she had been less welcoming than she should have been. For the times she had deferred to Donovan's version of events when she should have paid closer attention. She said she hoped I knew I was truly part of the family. I didn't cry on the phone. I waited until after I hung up, and then I sat quietly at my desk for a little while. And then I went back to the numbers. Because they were still there and they still needed doing, and I was still the person who was good at it. Some things don't change. The difference now is that I'm not carrying a backup report in my jacket pocket anymore. The difference is that I don't have to. I've thought about that Thanksgiving a lot since it happened, not with anger anymore. That surprised me, honestly. I expected the anger to stick around longer than it did. But what stayed instead was something quieter, something closer to clarity. Donovan spent 4 years building a case against me. 4 years of small erosions, the corrections in front of colleagues, the credit redirected, the steady, patient work of making me feel like I didn't belong. And for a long time, I let it cost me more than it should have. I second-guessed decisions I knew were right. I stayed later, worked harder, documented more, all to compensate for the fact that one person in that building had decided I wasn't worth respecting. That's a lot of energy to spend defending your right to simply do your job. What I understand now is that Donovan wasn't threatened by my failures. He was threatened by the fact that I kept showing up anyway. Every quarter, I improved the margins, every system I streamlined, every time I stayed methodical and calm when he expected me to crack. That was the thing he couldn't tolerate. Not incompetence, competence. That's a particular kind of cruelty when you think about it. To be punished, not for what you did wrong, but for what you did right. And here's the part I keep coming back to. The records I kept saved me. Not luck. Not someone swooping in to defend me at the right moment. My own habit of documenting everything. The same habit Donovan probably dismissed as overcaution. The same trait he likely saw as uptight or anxious. That is what put those pages in my envelope. That is what I set in front of Fletcher at that dinner table. Every choice I'd made quietly, without fanfare, without anyone watching, turned out to matter enormously when it counted most. I think about that when people tell me that being careful is the same as being afraid. It isn't. Careful is what you are when you understand that the world doesn't always hand you a fair moment, so you build one yourself, slowly, in advance, when nobody's paying attention. Fletcher's mother called me a month later and apologized And I meant it when I told her it was okay. I didn't say it to be gracious. I said it because I genuinely understood how it had happened, how someone can watch a dynamic for years and absorb the version of events that the loudest, most confident person in the room keeps presenting. That's not a moral failure. That's human. What matters is what you do when the fuller picture finally arrives. What Donovan did had a cost, and he paid it. Not because the universe arranged for justice, but because he made choices that left evidence, and I was the kind of person who knew how to find it. Actions accumulate. The work you do in private, good or bad, tends to surface eventually. He built something in the dark that collapsed in front of 60 people under fluorescent light and candlelight, and the particular silence of a room that has just understood something. I built something in the dark too. Mine held. I'm still with the company, still doing the books. The numbers still make sense to me in a way that people sometimes don't. But I think I understand people a little better now than I did before that night. Or maybe what I understand better is myself. What I'm capable of holding and how long I can hold it, and what it looks like when I finally set it down on a table in front of everyone. The envelope is empty now. I don't need it anymore. That's the part that feels most like winning.